that you all. Can you all see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. All right, so let's hop right in. So first of all, I'm so excited to present today for the DataPhilly meetup group, and just wanted to give a quick shout out to Rama and Alex, Chris, and Michael for setting all this up. I'm typically used to seeing my audience either in a conference room or a lecture hall, so it's definitely much harder to pick up on some social cues in the audience, but we're all in this together, and if you have any questions, please do feel free to add them in the chat. They'll be monitoring those for after the session, and I'd be glad to take any questions as well. We'll reserve some time at the end for that open forum, but for now, let's dive right into our talk on statistical paradoxes and logical fallacies. Don't believe the lies your data tells. I hate to admit it, but your data is lying to you, and more often than you think. Having clean data with high volume, velocity, and variety doesn't necessarily protect one from the possibility of reaching those spurious conclusions to research questions of interest. And despite what you may have learned in Statistics 101, a statistically significant p-value really isn't always groundbreaking, and it's not always the thing you should be looking for. Because all data can really be coerced and bribed to tell any story that you want to tell. So as a data practitioner, it's our duty to be cognizant of the possible pitfalls that abound and how to navigate those common traps responsibly. So I know I'm going to be talking about statistical paradoxes today, but I want to take a brief moment to introduce myself and a little bit more context to my background in the field of data science. So I studied logic, discrete math, and statistics, and I bring experience from both industry and academia. I previously stood as the director of data science for the New York City Data Science Academy and the executive director of the Masters of Statistical Practice program at Carnegie Mellon University. And at both institutions, I took pride in both professionally developing students and also aiding in the redesign of technical curricula. And over the course of my time at both institutions, I ended up delivering over 3,000 hours worth of lectures to graduate student audiences. But on the other hand, in industry, I most recently helped thwart cybercrime as the director of security data science at Empower Retirement. And through a lot of serendipity, I ended up here now at Dataiku as a lead data scientist. And from the bottom of my heart, I've never been so happy to be a part of a team attacking challenges and working with colleagues across the globe that really fascinate me every day. So let me start with a couple of fun facts about me. When I'm not crunching numbers on my computer, I'm crunching my abs in the studio as I'm an avid dancer, choreographer, and CrossFitter, which explains why I can only count to 5, 6, 7, 8 and add and subtract in multiples of 5. Now, weightlifting barbells does provide a massive adrenaline rush for me every morning at 5:30 a.m., but I really get that adrenaline rush from teaching as well. It turns out that my average heart rate tends to be on par or even higher when teaching or giving a lecture than during my morning workouts. So this is a screenshot here of my average heart rate data during a semester when I taught 9 a.m. class at Carnegie Mellon. So just imagine the heart palpitations I'm having right now presenting in front of all of you today. So, all right, that's enough about me. Too many fun facts. We're really here today to take a brief tour of the handful of statistical paradoxes without encountering a single mathematical equation. But I have to be honest, this is truly a misnamed presentation. Instead, this talk should really be called Statistical Not So Paradoxes, because we really are not going to be discussing any true paradoxes today. Well, what do I mean by that? The paradoxes we will discuss are not truly self-contradictory, but rather they're unintuitive findings. Take, for example, this sentence. This statement is false. Well, this is a true paradox because it's self-contradictory and self-referential. Suppose that the statement is true. Well, then it must be false, which leads us to a contradiction. And suppose that the statement is false. Well, then it must be true, which is also, of course, a contradiction. Well, these are not the types of paradoxes we'll be discussing today. Instead, we'll be discussing unintuitive findings based on perspective. So take, for example, these two gentlemen having a debate about the image they see in front of them. You can consider that image their data. Well, who is right? Who is wrong? Neither gentleman is technically incorrect. They're simply taking information that's presented in front of them from their own frame of reference and communicating the results to each other. We do very much the same thing as data scientists when we're interpreting data. And in that vein, the impetus behind this presentation is to highlight that it is very easy to lie by telling the truth with data. If I'm looking at the gentleman's data with this image on the floor, and I have some ulterior motive, I may choose to present that the symbol is a 6 rather than a 9. But the subjective choice, paired with my own bias, may be telling a story that is misleading, either intentionally or unintentionally. So I have a quote here from Winston S. Churchill that is a little bit of a joke, but I think the point is quite valid. He says, "Do not trust any statistics you did not fake yourself." And I think it gets across the concept of lying by telling the truth, especially with data. So what should we do? Well, the best way to protect ourselves from these types of problems is to be aware of them, know what to be on the lookout for, and know the right types of questions to ask with a healthy dose of skepticism. So the discussion topics we'll be talking about today span a range of items. We'll delve into 3 paradoxes in particular: Simpson's paradox, regression toward the mean, and statistical versus practical significance. Now, trust me, if this is just gibberish and jargon at this point, do not fret. I'll make sure to highlight the bottom line along the way as we go on this tour together. So let's hop in. The first topic we'll be discussing today is Simpson's paradox, and it's named after a statistician, Edward H. Simpson, who first described this phenomenon in 1951. But Pearson, Ewell, and other famous statisticians also mentioned similar effects in writings as early as 1899. The 2 main research questions of interest that we'll aim to answer via this paradox are: is more data always better? And how can the inclusion or exclusion of data obfuscate a previously held conclusion? Nowadays, we often hear of the concept of streaming data and big data, and that more is always better. However, I've always been a big believer in the notion that it's not always the volume of data that matters, but it's the collection of the right data that matters. And that's a whole topic of discussion in and of itself. But when we're building statistical and machine learning models of phenomena in the world, the concept of garbage in, garbage out pretty much always applies. Furthermore, I hate to admit it, but computers are a little bit dumb. They'll just do what we tell them to do without question, even if the process itself is illogical. So we as human beings must stand as a filter for reaching these spurious conclusions or faulty analyses. Having the human in the loop is always important. But how can it be possible to flip a previously held conclusion about which we're pretty confident? You might ask, if there is only one manifestation of a process in the world, how can there be conflicting conclusions regarding the sole mechanism at play? So to investigate this and other paradoxes today, let's pretend that we're a professor at a university teaching a very large class. Now, this lecture we're teaching is quite large. It actually has a few hundred students, and it's part of a general education requirement in order to graduate. So many students across the university will be taking this class. And today is a very special day because, well, we're administering a big exam. One question we might want to ask is, what is the relationship between time spent studying and exam score? Now, just using our own intuition and experience, we might assume that the association is positive, meaning that students who study very diligently are more likely to have a higher score on their exam. And similarly, on the flip side, we might assume that students who don't study very much or are distracted or not as diligent in their study techniques are more likely to have a lower score. So if we graph these 2 variables against one another, where we have the number of hours studied on the x-axis and the student exam scores on the y-axis, we should expect there to be an upward trending association. Now, remember, this is a fictitious example that's slightly contrived for our illustration purposes. But let's suppose that once we've graded the exams, it turns out that the observed association is completely unexpected. The association between studying and score is completely flipped from what we hypothesized. We actually find that the more a student studies, the lower their exam score, and vice versa. How can this be? What is going on? Well, if we return to our research question of interest, we asked, what's the relationship between time spent studying and exam score? And we came to find that for our exam, this is completely flipped from our hypothesis. But we're pretty confident that this is unintuitive. In the grand scheme of things, studying for an exam shouldn't reduce the average expected score. So what's going on here? Let's return to our lecture hall once again. Maybe there are other variables at play here that we didn't consider before. Remember, this is a large lecture applicable to many students across the university. It turns out that since this is a large lecture, there are students across various seniority levels attending. Maybe it's the case that this level of experience or seniority has something to do with how the students study or perform on exams in general. And once again, this is a little bit of a joke or a funny meme on how freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors do their homework on the weekend, but I think it drives the point home. Maybe freshman students have to put in a lot more work because of their unfamiliarity of the lecture style or haven't yet formed their study habits that work best for them in college. On the flip side, maybe more senior students are used to the college style of learning and already know the most efficient study habits for themselves as individuals. So let's use that information. Let's return back to our exam data. And now let's break this out by grade level. We might see a different story emerging. In aggregate, when we considered the association between our study and exam score, we saw a grand inverse relationship. However, when considering the subgroups based upon grade level, in general, given a freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior, the more they study, the higher their average score tends to be. The association is completely flipped. Now, this was a fake example, but of course, Simpson's paradox manifests within various industries in many real-world situations. At UC Berkeley in 1973, there was a very famous study surrounding gender bias in graduate admissions. The admissions figures displayed that, in general, men applying were more likely than women to be admitted. However, it turns out that women tended to apply to more competitive departments with lower rates of admission, even among qualified applicants, such as the English department, whereas men tended to apply to less competitive departments with higher rates of admission among the qualified candidates, like in engineering and chemistry. So when parsed by department, the data showed that women were more likely to be admitted, whereas in general, the frequency of men being admitted was higher. The paradox also appears in the medical industry, and in particular for the treatment of kidney stones. So a real study in 1986 compared the success rates of two different procedures for treating kidney stones. One was much more invasive, costly, painful, but generally more successful than the other. The key question here was, which procedure was better? It turns out that there was a confounding variable here, which was the severity of the case itself, or the size of the kidney stone. So despite the treatment method, in general, larger kidney stones are simply just harder to cure. And thus doctors tended to suggest the more invasive procedure for the more severe cases. Thus, the procedure we consider more successful changes depending on the perspective in light of this new information, the severity of the case. The paradox also appears in entertainment. So for example, when we consider the batting averages of Derek Jeter of the New York Yankees and David Justice of the Atlanta Braves in the years of 95 and 96, we see Simpson's paradox arising. In aggregate, Derek Jeter seems to outperform, but conversely, for each individual year, if we only look at 1 year, David Justice actually has the better batting average. And lastly, one more example, we observe Simpson's paradox arising occasionally in the field of law as well. In the counties of Florida in 1976 and 1977, there seemed to be racial disparity in the application of the death penalty. One conclusion was based on data aggregated by the race of the defendant, yet the opposite conclusion was reached when considering the data parsed by the race of the victim. So in general, regardless of the industry in question, it's very important to keep at the forefront of our minds when we are drawing possibly impactful conclusions during data analyses. Depending on how somebody presents their data, they may be able to tell the story that they want to tell, which can certainly raise deep and ethical concerns. So how do we protect ourselves? If we return to our research questions of interest, how do we answer them? Well, truthfully, we're not really sure because it always depends. If we add more data or split data into groups based upon new variables, that can possibly be informative. However, Alternatively, it could be the case that the subgroups in question are arbitrary and therefore lead us to those spurious conclusions. We also must consider common notions of data analysis such as correlation not implying causation and other familiar adages we've heard before. Is the variable I'm considering likely directly associated with the conclusion I'm trying to draw? And how do I know? Once again, that's a whole discussion in and of itself, but what should we do? When facing Simpson's paradox, we need to consider the context. In particular, we should carefully analyze the situations described by the statistics and consider whether or not they are, any latent variables or hidden variables. Additionally, we need to consider the decision process by which we are drawing these conclusions. Ideally, the explanation of the process would be logical, tangible, and understandable in ways that seem to make intuitive sense. So, for example, with our exam score scenario, a subgroup analysis based on student seniority was appropriate as a consideration of a latent variable. Whereas for the kidney stones, the size and severity induced bias in the decision process that the doctors took in assigning the treatments to patients. So in that case, an aggregation may make more sense in context. Now, as a side note, it is important to note that these scenarios were not experiments. They weren't truly being performed with a control group or an experimental setup, and so on and so forth, but rather they're observational studies. So the conclusions of association are certainly not as strong. And that's basically the statistician's way of saying allegedly, but really it's just a way of highlighting uncertainty in our claims. The bottom line here is that whenever Simpson's paradox arises, it's always important to consider the context and be aware that someone might be able to lie by technically telling the truth. Now, I could talk about Simpson's paradox all day, but in the interest of time, I'd like to continue our tour and move on to the next paradox, which is regression toward the mean. Now, with regression toward the mean, the two research questions that arise are, is an observed trend, or is an observed event truly a trend? And how can previously noted behaviors be a marker for the complete opposite behavior in the future? Seems counterintuitive. Well, if I see a phenomenon being performed once, should I expect that phenomenon to happen again? Is something truly a trend? Maybe something else is at play. In order to investigate regression toward the mean, let's return once again to our class of students in that big lecture hall. Now, let's be honest, our students are probably pretty fatigued. They've been listening to us talk about statistical paradoxes, and they even took an exam yesterday. At least we've been a pretty good professor and have already graded those exams so they can, look at their scores and, find out how they did. So let's take a look at those scores. What's the distribution look like? Well, typically exam scores follow a normal or Gaussian shape, which is represented here by what's commonly known as a bell curve. On the x-axis, we'll have the student scores, and the low and high performers will tend to be towards the edges or the tails of this distribution. We can see that the low scorers in red barely passed, and the high scorers in green got nearly a perfect score, or even maybe got a little bit of extra credit on top. So let's suppose we do something interesting. And fair warning, we're kind of a little bit of a weird professor. Let's see what happens. Let's take all the exceptionally good and bad students on the edges of that distribution and give them feedback based on their performance. Remember, this is just a fictitious example for illustration purposes, so I'm not actually advising doing this in real life, but roll with me on this one. Let's say we take the high-performing students, the 10%, and bring them into our office. And let's say we congratulate them. We tell them that they are the top scoring students, that we're very, very proud of them and all of their achievements and accolades. And if they keep this up, they're going to be at the top of their class. On the flip side, maybe we're a little bit evil. And we take those low performing 10% of students, we bring them in our office separately, and instead we scold and reprimand them. Maybe we tell them something like, you didn't do well enough. We're very unproud of you. If you keep it up, you will be a failure and you're not going to graduate. So in this situation, we're pretty harsh, but honestly, that's just the half of it. The next day, when the students arrive to that lecture, little do they know that we really are truly an evil, evil professor. And today they're in for a surprise. And you know what that surprise is? A pop quiz. This pop quiz is very, very similar to the exam the students recently took just a couple days ago. It's on the same material, the same topics, but maybe with slightly different questions. So, if this is a math test, maybe it's the exact same material, but the numbers are slightly different. So here we can assume that the students really didn't have any additional time to study, any more than they did for the first exam. After all, they weren't expecting a pop quiz in the first place. So basically, we can consider it pretty much the same exam, just a second time around. If we remember back to the distribution of scores on the first exam, we had the low and high performers on the extremes. And remember, they received the negative and positive feedback in our office, respectively. Well, let's see what happens. When the low performing students took the pop quiz, their score ended up being higher than on the first exam. Conversely, when the high performing students took the pop quiz, their score ended up being lower than their first examination. Ultimately, the students at both ends of the extreme for the first exam ended up performing more like average students on the pop quiz. We would say that they regressed towards the mean. Once again, we might ask ourselves the question, what is going on? Specifically, we might ask ourselves, what is the relationship between this feedback delivery and performance? Did praise truly influence the great students to maybe get lazy and thus they reduce their score? Did scolding really end up motivating those underperforming students to study harder? Can we really claim that praise or scolding affects a student's score? Once again, we're not really sure what's going on. So it's often helpful to take an extreme perspective in these situations, just to see what's going on. So let's do that. Let's take an extreme perspective. Suppose that the test scores are 100% based on luck. No skill, no aptitude required at all, just based on luck. Let's look at this through the lens of complete randomness using a little contraption called a Galton board. Now, this device is named after Sir Francis Galton and approximates a normal or Gaussian distribution from a binomial with many trials. Essentially, there are thousands of tiny metal balls that all start at the top at the very same spot. And as they waterfall down and bounce on these pegs, they have an equal likelihood with a 50-50 chance of falling to the left or to the right. Most of those balls will fall towards the center because that's close to where they started. But essentially, the average of these 50-50 chances centers around that center point. But on the off chance, some will happen to fall at the extremes. Now, this image is repeating on a loop, so it's always going to be exactly the same. But imagine if you were to flip this contraption over and over and over again. It's pretty much always going to make the same familiar bell-shaped curve, approximately. So let's exclusively hone in on the low-scoring students represented here by the balls falling in the red band. Let's take only those balls that fell in the red band and bring them back to the top of the Galton board and drop them down a second time. What do you think will happen? Well, once again, some may end up on the extremes, but most will actually fall towards the middle, even though the first time they fell in the low bin. The same can be said for if we exclusively hone in on the high-scoring students in the green. If everything is based on luck and luck alone, you're far more likely to regress towards the mean on subsequent trials following an extreme occurrence on the edges. But realistic scenarios of regression toward the mean are rarely based 100% on luck. In actuality, there is a dichotomy between chance, luck, variability, and error, and on the flip side, the skill, talent, and aptitude. If we think about the students who were low scorers, they really fall into two main buckets: those who were unskilled and not lucky, and those who were average students, but maybe just got lucky or maybe just got unlucky in this exam. Similarly, if we think about the students who were high scorers, they also fall into two main buckets. They may be students who are truly skilled and also not unlucky, and those who are maybe truly average performers, but they just got lucky with the questions on the exam. So let's return back to focusing on the low performers. The truly unskilled students will have a second chance at being lucky when they're tested again, which would result in an increase in their score. And similarly, the truly average students will be unlikely to repeat their unlucky streak when they're tested again, which would also result in bumping their score up higher. A similar occurrence can be explained with the higher scorers. The truly skilled students have a second chance at being unlucky when they're tested again, which would result in a decrease in their score. And the same thing goes true for the average students. The average students will be unlikely to repeat their lucky streak when they're tested again, which would also result in a decrease in their score, having them regress back towards the mean. So if we return to our research questions of interest, we need to consider the process at hand. What can be explained or quantified by some measure of interest? For example, the skill level or aptitude of a student taking a test. And what is the level of variability that is due to chance, or maybe a lurking variable that we saw before in Simpson's paradox? These are admittedly not easy questions to answer because they really depend on the events at hand. While this was once again a fictitious example, regression towards the mean manifests within various industries. For the educational realm, the relationship between positive and negative feedback and performance was actually investigated with the training of Israeli fighter pilots. So this is really not truly a fictitious example, but a paradoxical result that in one light could possibly negate years of research underscoring the effect of positive feedback in motivating others to succeed. And that's personally a tactic I like to take daily when motivating my team. But this phenomenon can really just be explained by regression toward the mean. In the medical industry, if a clinical trial suggests that a drug or a treatment outperforms all other treatments for a condition, then it is more likely that it will perform closer to the average in the next clinical trial. Once again, this reinforces the importance of a control group and all the concepts of experimental design. But as we mentioned earlier, that is definitely a discussion for another time. You might have heard of the jinx of the Sports Illustrated cover, where in entertainment, if a player appears on the cover of a magazine, then there's this narrative that's often written about them that surfaces in subsequent seasons where they allegedly became too arrogant, or maybe they broke under pressure and they just fell off their pedestal. There's an adage that says it's hard to get on top, but it's even harder to stay on top. While that does hold true here, it's often explained in part by the phenomenon of regression toward the mean. This also appears in entertainment with movies and music albums that have sequels that maybe don't perform as well. I think we probably all heard of a friend at some point saying that the original was so much better than the sequel. Again, it's just regression towards the mean. And of course, a last example is with business performance and profits being considered from quarter to quarter. A really fantastic or terrible quarter of profits tends to be followed by one that is more average. The bottom line here is just to be aware of this dichotomy between random variability, or the error of the process that we're trying to describe, and the actual performance, which is based on metrics or the measures that we're attempting to quantify. Once again, I could talk about regression to the mean all day, but in the interest of time, why don't we turn our attention to our final paradox for the day, which is statistical versus practical significance, one of my absolute favorites. And for this, we'll have two research questions of interest once again, which are, is an association worth my time? And when do incontrovertible conclusions lead us to not act on a valid association? Why would it be the case that we may identify that X is associated with a positive way with Y and an impactful way about which we care, but then we choose not to exploit it or implement it or even use that knowledge at all? It seems pretty counterintuitive. One last time, let's return to our classroom just to see what's going on. I can tell at this point the students are really tired of us, but maybe we're truly not an evil professor after all. Maybe we really just want to help those students learn as best as they possibly can. And we're trying lots of different ways. Suppose we try to find out what works best for those students studying. Let's say we end up taking the students and splitting them into two types of study groups to figure out which study tactic works best. The first group will go to normal recitations, where they break down into smaller groups and do practice problems with a teaching assistant. And maybe a different group doesn't do the recitations. Instead, they get specifically constructed practice problems and exams from expensive review books with hundreds of pages. And as a side note, I personally remember having these stacks of review books for the SAT, the ACT, or AP exams years ago. They're really, really heavy, and they definitely gave my back some problems. Let's say when the students take their next exam, we once again graph their scores and see a familiar bell-shaped curve. However, when we split by the study tactic, a slightly different story emerges. It seems as though, on average, students with the test prep books, here depicted by the blue curve, they often outperformed those in the recitation, who are represented here by the pink curve. Now, although this difference is detectable, you can see here that the curves are separated ever so slightly in their peaks. There is so much overlap in the distributions of the scores. We might ask ourselves, is it truly valuable for students to go through the arduous process of buying these expensive books, lugging them around, and spending time to go through tons of multiple choice review questions? Let's think about this a little bit more. It looks like the difference in the average scores, or the distance between those two peaks, is really small, and the overlap of the curves is really big. Said another way, if we take a student that is slightly better than average from the recitation group in pink, their performance is better than most of the students in the test prep group in blue. Similarly, a slightly worse than average student in the test prep group is often outperformed by the students in the recitation group. So although this difference is detectable, and we can claim that on average, students in the test prep group perform better, are we truly going to act on this finding? Along with statistical significance, we need to assess the practicality of the evidence. And that practicality relies on our notion of the time, effort, and money we invest, and the return on investment we end up getting. We've already seen this first scenario where the curves overlap quite a bit. But what about this alternate scenario where the curves are much more separated? Another concept that may help us assess the practicality of the evidence is that of confidence intervals. So for the example on the left, I might be able to claim that we're 95% confident that the true average increase in score for the students using the test prep book is between 1 and 3 points, maybe about 2 points. We can claim that this is statistically significant, and we're very confident in that claim, but is it worth it? I think most of us would agree it's not really worth it just for 1 or 2 points. But in contrast, for the example on the right, I might claim that the average increase is about 15 points, maybe ranging between 5 and 25 points for the average student. Again, this is statistically significant, but we ask ourselves, is it worth it? In this case, I think, yeah, possibly. The bottom line is that no matter what you heard in Statistics 101, the statistical significance really isn't the only thing that should matter when we're considering taking action on an association that we think is plausible and supported by our data. There's a much bigger story to tell. As a brief aside, I wanted to comment upon a related idea that has to do with experimental design, with a quote by Ronald Fisher. He was a British statistician in the 1900s, and he said, "To call in the statistician after the experiment is done may be no more than asking him to perform a post-mortem examination. He may be able to say what the experiment died of." So what is he trying to say here? Why perform an experiment in the first place if we're not going to be able to detect or induce a change of a magnitude about which we care? Why spend a lot of effort to set up an experiment just to find out that the results are statistically insignificant. Yet the experiment wasn't planned in a way that would have provided us the significance for a change about which we care in the first place. The bottom line here is to just not be a victim of bad planning. And on this subject, we could talk about power analysis, true positives versus false positives, reducing mean squared error variance, and so on and so forth. But that's really not the point of the discussion here today. The last idea I'd like to make note of in studies like these is the concept of multiple testing, and to caution us against spurious conclusions brought on by experimenting just for experimentation's sake. Be aware of spurious conclusions brought on by multiple testing without penalty. And what do I mean by that? Well, this is best illustrated by my absolute favorite XKCD comic, which I'll briefly walk us through on the next slide. So here, someone runs into the room and shouts to the data scientist that they think jelly beans cause acne. And that's a pretty outlandish claim. The data scientists conclude that there isn't really evidence to support that claim, but the person says that they hear it's really only a certain color of jelly beans that causes acne. So the data scientists go off, run some numbers, and investigate. They find no link between purple jelly beans and acne. They find no link between brown jelly beans and acne. They find no link between pink, blue, and teal jelly beans and acne. They continue on with salmon, red, turquoise, magenta, and yellow jelly beans. Still no link to acne. They continue with beige, lilac, black, peach, and orange. Still no link to jelly beans and acne. And then they go 5 more times. But notice in this 4th pane, the quote says, "We found a link between green jelly beans and acne." The p-value is less than 0.05. So the next day, guess what happens? Splashed across the front page of the daily newspaper is this headline: "Green jelly beans are linked to acne. We are 95% confident." And there is only a 5% chance that this was a coincidence. But is this really the case? Are these results reproducible and replicable? Probably not. If we read a headline like this, we should have a healthy dose of skepticism. What really happened? The data scientists tested 20 different jelly beans, each with a 5% chance of a false positive. One ended up surfacing as statistically significant, which we would have expected if we knew the whole story and not just what was written in the newspaper headlines. Think about it this way. If I close my eyes and I throw darts at a target, most of the times I'll miss. But occasionally, just by random chance when I'm really lucky, I'll hit that center bullseye. But it really has nothing to do with my skill at throwing darts. Okay, so whether we're talking about blindly throwing darts at a target or the link between jelly beans and acne, we have to consider the practicality of the evidence. It's actually quite irresponsible for articles or papers like this to be published in this sensationalized way without the true candor and highlighting the actual details of the entire study. If the public was told that lots of tests were performed over and over and over again, but we're only cherry picking a single test to discuss, that may tell a different story and tap into our skeptical senses. Now, I don't mean to scare the whole audience here. Rest assured that skilled data scientists and statisticians should know how to employ methods with fancy names like Bonferroni, Tukey, Dunnett, and Chaffee to correct for these types of scenarios and come to more accurate conclusions. But once again, that's a discussion for another time. I'd just like us to heighten our skeptical senses when reading some sensationalized claims. If we return back to our research questions of interest for statistical versus practical significance, the bottom line is that it depends on the practicality of the evidence. If we do come upon a statistically significant finding, we may not always act upon it because either it might not be truly valid or it may not be worth our time. Lastly, statistical versus practical significance should be considered in many settings. We already saw an educational example here with comparing exam scores and study tactics, but it also appears in the medical industry. We can think about clinical trials for weight loss programs. Maybe it can be technically claimed that you can lose a pound or two very confidently by following a rigorous program, but that could be over the course of a very long time. And it may not be worth it for us for the effect and effort that we put in. Maybe there's a new drug that claims to reduce your blood pressure ever so slightly, but it comes with a lot of side effects. Would it be worth it to us? In most cases, probably not, even though it's statistically significant. In advertising or social media marketing, campaigns might claim that they're successful because of a click rate being increased by a very small fraction of a percentage. And I used to be a social media analyst. This was the subject of discussion all the time, how to make something go viral. However, it might not be worth it to completely change the code on a website. It depends on the return on investment for that change and the time, effort, and cost associated with the work behind making those updates, even though they might be statistically significant. This also appears in the social sciences, and specifically with the study of the behaviors of introverts versus extroverts. Differences appear in moderate activities like smiling at strangers, but behaviors are the same at the extremes, like being uncomfortable in large crowds. It's similar no matter where you fall on the spectrum of being an introvert or an extrovert. In all these examples, the difference in the average value of whatever is being measured is smaller than the standard deviation or the spread of each of those groups. This just means that the large overlap and similarity between the groups exists, even though there might be minor differences too. So although those differences may be statistically detectable, there's so much commonality between the groups such that it might not be practical to even care about it in the first place. Another funny way of thinking about this is with identical twins. Technically speaking, we all know that identical twins truly aren't identical. In many ways, it could be their personalities, their interests, or even the details of their facial features. However, maybe a brand new person they've never met before might not be able to tell the difference. It just depends on how closely they look. So speaking of taking a closer look, I'm hopeful I was able to grab your attention for our discussion today. But just in case, let's briefly review the main statistical paradoxes we covered today. For part one, we discussed how the inclusion or exclusion of data can obfuscate a previously held conclusion. And we found that latent variables and the intricacies of the decision process were important to investigate when encountering Simpson's paradox. For part two, we considered how previously noted behaviors can be a marker for the complete opposite behavior in the future. And we found that a blend of chance, error, and skill were important to investigate when encountering regression towards the mean. And last but not least, for part three, we considered how conclusive findings can lead us to not act on a valid association. We found that the practicality of the evidence, where it either didn't make sense or wasn't worth it, or wasn't important for us to investigate. And that was important for us to keep at top of mind when thinking about statistical versus practical significance. And with that, I just wanted to say a big thank you for your time over the course of the last 45 minutes. And maybe open up the floor for questions if we have time. So I will stop sharing my screen and take a look at the chat.